James looked up, allowing the water to rush across his face for some time. He'd only been on planet for a couple of hours at this point. However, he had already needed to shower away the sweat that was constantly building up in the heat. It reminded him a lot of the trips he had taken to the Kenya region in his youth, back when they still had regular contact to Nia's parents, as well as her extended family. Of course, those trips had been a thing of the past for a long time by now. However, he still remembered the heat being something he had struggled with even back then. Today, due to his extended stay in places with the standard temperature of about 305 Kelvin, he had become a bit hardier when it came to resisting temperatures, but on this planet's climate, or at least that of this specific part of the planet, was still far outside of his comfort zone. However, due to the Miat's very similar body type to that of the humans, most things around here were designed in ways that mirrored how they were back on Earth. At least if you ignored how smooth everything was, due to the consistent philosophy of never designing anything with even so much as a hint of a sharp edge or corner. Everything was quite easy to use as a small-sized, slender and upright biped. Here and there were some differences, of course, like any chair or seat involving some form of hole or gap in the backrest, that accommodated for a Miat's tail, for example, but it wasn't like these things caused actual problems if you didn't have a tail. Of course, since this trip had been both planned and financed not by himself, but by some sort of agent or maybe team of agents back on Earth in his name, the hotel they stayed at was quite expensive and luxurious, and therefore possibly didn't offer the most authentic experience of typical Dunama. James doubted, for example, that the usual showers on this planet, or even in this area of the planet, were generally designed as wall-integrated waterfalls with fittings surrounding rock aesthetics, and a sort of short, winding tunnel providing privacy instead of a door or a curtain. A feature that he found to be quite impractical, as it added a good amount of walking to the process of getting in and out of the shower, even if the minor inconvenience wasn't at all worth complaining about. In fact, he would have really felt quite bad complaining about something that was most likely a huge luxury in some way. First world problems and all that. Did that phrase even apply on another planet? James stopped the water and aggressively shook out his head, both to pre-dry his face and hair before starting his journey through the shower's entrance, and to try and get his mind away from focusing on banalities. His feet wetly and loudly slapped on the stony floor of the bathroom, echoing ever so slightly from the barren walls of the short tunnel. A sound that he was sure these walls had never heard before, given how quietly the padded feet of Miat tended to walk. He exited the tunnel to be immediately greeted by a full-length mirror, with his reflection looking back at him exhaustedly. At least this way he didn't have to turn and look for the towel that he had deposited on the stool somewhere next to the entrance, since he clearly saw it in the room's mirror image. As he dried himself off, he flinched briefly, as he inadvertently touched some tender spots around his left shoulder. Inspecting them with both his fingers and his eyes, he could feel them, but not yet see them, although from the way they felt, he was sure that there would be a discoloration of some sort, following soon enough. It seemed that, maybe, he would need some precautions before he got dressed again. Quickly, he finished the drying process, and in a routine fashion applied his usual medical ointment to his scar skin, giving the aching spots he had found a good rub in the process to encourage blood flow in the area. Suddenly, a loud sound that was situated firmly in between a shriek and a loud hiss pierced the silence, dulled slightly by the door separating him from the main room. As silence followed for a moment after that, James carefully walked over to said door, but keeping in mind that he still hadn't dressed himself yet, he stopped right before it. "You okay?" he carefully yelled out, his hand on the door's handle while he hoped that nothing serious had happened. It took a few seconds for Shida to answer, and he was already in the process of storming out to rush to her aid, when her voice finally sounded again. "Yeah, I'm okay," she said, with a remaining hint of agitation in her voice, although it sounded mostly relieved. "I just got spooked for a second, that's all." Since he was already firmly pressing the door handle down, James decided to slowly push it open, and briefly peek his head out to get a better picture of the situation. "Spooked?" he asked, having to look past the large bed situated next to the bathroom door to see Shida standing somewhere on the other side of the room, where she seemingly slowly approached the wall. By what? Likely because his voice suddenly wasn't muffled by the door anymore. Her ear briefly twitched in his direction before her head turned to look at him. Her eyebrows lifted in slight bemusement as she saw that only his head was poking out through the door. "Nothing," she assured him, and simultaneously gestured at the wall she had been creeping towards, with an outstretched thumb. "Just a dumb Lechegolfs. Jumped out from somewhere when I turned the TV on. Likely got spooked itself. No idea how it got in here." "Well, That was a word James hadn't heard before. So far he also hadn't noticed the constant droning of some sort of news show he didn't understand coming from another corner of the room, although now that he was actually listening, it was hard to overhear. He couldn't quite see what Shada was pointing at there from his position, so he quickly wrapped his towel around his waist and inquisitively stepped out into the room to inspect what had garnered this kind of reaction from his girlfriend. As he stepped around the large bed to get a clear view of the wall, his eyebrows raised considerably as he saw something quite large clinging to it. It was surely half a measure long, with a long, slender body and limbs, and flatly outward fanning feathers with brown and off-green colours. The best thing James could compare it to was the mixture of a lizard and a bird, although without any wings. Even its lips were hardened into some sort of beak, almost like that of a turtle. It sat unmovingly on the wall, seemingly freezing in the gaze of the two much larger predators staring at it, at least as long as they kept their distance. "Must have crawled in through one of the vents or something," Shada commented, crossing her arms as she watched James approach, her eyes gliding along the visible parts of his skin for a second before shooting back up to meet his. "Was probably hunting bugs behind the dresser." "Maybe," James replied, tilting his head as he studied the animal. With an inquisitive look, he briefly glanced over at Shada and asked, "Is it dangerous?" She shrugged and briefly shook her head. "Not really, but they bite and scratch when you grab them. Learned that the hard way, like most kittens," she informed him, sounding not all too amused at that last part, probably digging up some painful memories. "Well, I have a metal arm," James joked, walking past Shada and towards the lizard, hearing her let out a sigh as he did. To his surprise, it didn't even try to get away, instead pressing down against the wall, nearly fully flattening its body. An effect that was further strengthened by the feathers doing the same thing, probably blending it quite well with the background, had its colours not clashed so drastically with the wood covering the walls. As James raised his arm, it also let out a long, sharp hiss, seemingly using the entire volume of his lungs to keep the tone, that sounded like someone ripping apart a sturdy piece of paper up as long as possible. "Ooh, angry pancake," he joked, as the animal glared at him with a slitted pupil and a large greenish eye. But, despite his quipping, his brain kicked back in before he could grab the thing, while running fully on autopilot, stopping him in the action, as he realised that he really didn't have a good plan of what to do with it once he had it in his grasp. After all, it would likely not be very happy about being grabbed, and therefore he could hardly just put it back down once Pandora's box had been opened. Therefore he pulled his arm back again, deciding that it was likely better if he got dressed before attempting anything here. "We should probably bring him outside," he informed Shada as he turned back to her, leaving the lizard some room to breathe. As he did, his eyes fell on the large window on the other side of the room, seeing that slowly, the image of the city got darker, as the system's stars started to hide behind the horizon bit by bit. "We'll want to find him in our bed tonight." Shada's ears wriggled slightly as he passed her on his way back to the bathroom, where his fresh change of clothes was still impatiently waiting for him. "Or we could just get someone to do it for us," she commented with her arms still crossed. "It isn't supposed to be here in the first place." James just shook his head. "We don't need to bother anyone for that," he said decidedly, and rotated his fully organic shoulder for a second. "I can handle much worse than a little lizard." Shada sighed again. "It is what we're paying for," she informed him with quite a bit of emphasis in her tone, almost like she wanted to tell him something. "We are not paying for anything," James reminded her as a retort, as he reached the bathroom's door again, although he did stop there for a second to allow her to finish her thought. "You know what I mean," Shada countered humorously, and looked at James intently. In a more direct and flat tone, she added, "It's how things work around here, James." James immediately wanted to talk back to her again. However, he stopped himself with his voice dying in his throat, making him just uselessly open his mouth. Closing it again, he cleared his throat for a second while thinking how he could better approach this. He looked back at Shada almost meekly and softly said, "It's just one lizard." And as she still didn't seem convinced, he also nodded in the direction of the window, where it seemed that it got dark quite quickly here on Dunima. "And we could also take another look outside, now that things are starting to cool down," he added, with a bit of a hopeful raise in his voice as he spoke. Shada's nostrils flared for a second as her eyes narrowed down at him, but after a second of scrutinizing him with her gaze alone, she caved with a deep exhale. "Fine," she said, her arms dropping to her side instead of remaining crossed before her chest. In a mumble, she then quietly added, "It's just one lizard." That last part was seemingly directed more at herself than at him. And since she, despite having caved, Still didn't look all too happy with that conclusion, James briefly knocked against the door to get her attention. "Mind helping me with weights?" he asked softly, as she looked back over to him, giving her a gentle smile, along with a look that hopefully symbolized that he appreciated her putting up with his antics. After a split second of contemplation, Shida returned his smile and nodded, coming over to the door with quick steps. Shortly after, James stood in front of the mirror again, grunting slightly as he tried to get used to the newly applied pressure to the aching parts of his left shoulder. To relieve some of it, and hopefully prevent things from getting any worse, he bandaged the whole thing up rather tightly, creating a sort of improvised cushion around his tissue. Now Shida was in the process of properly tightening the straps of the article that he now had draped over the bandaged shoulder behind his back, making sure that it wouldn't slip around even if he moved with it a lot. He felt his weight bearing down on him, ironically bringing his body back into balance even if he wore it on only one side. The strange part tube sleeve, part shoulder strap was specifically designed to counter the weight of his new robotic appendage that weighed considerably more than an organic one, hopefully counteracting and preventing any back or balance problems, as well as muscle or joint stiffness caused by improperly distributed weight. Right now, having to wear it was still rather unpleasant as he was still getting used to it, but his future self would surely thank him for not ruining his body. As soon as the strap was tightly secured to his body, he thanked Shida with a smile and started to put on the rest of his clothes. Briefly, he felt her fingers glide along his synthetic arm, almost contemplatively, as she stepped away to give him some room. As soon as he at least wore pants and a shirt again, James wondered if he would skip wearing a jacket, at least for tonight, even if that would leave his arm situation exposed to the world. Mostly, he really didn't want to immediately have to deal with the heat again, after having just showered off its effects. But, in the end, he knew he would have to present himself properly, so he begrudgingly slipped the long sleeves over his arms and shoulders, completing his look. Turning around, he immediately pulled Shida into a hug and kissed her on the forehead, which she begrudgingly accepted, without scurrying away this time. "Thank you," he repeated his earlier gesture properly, before releasing her from his arms again and taking a single step back. "Now, I say I get our little visitor, and you hop over really quick to let our bodyguards know that we're going out in a second. At least a few of them should be ready to follow up, even now." He wasn't particularly happy about having to report to someone anytime he wanted to go out or do anything really, but he also wasn't going to make their job infinitely harder than it had to be, and somehow he highly doubted that any of them would want him to try and go undercover quite yet. "Just don't get your face scratched off," Shida replied, a hint of teasing humour having returned to her voice, before she turned on the spot to go on ahead out of the bathroom, although her tail did noticeably deliberately brush along his side as she did so. Soon after, James stood in front of the lizard again, this time with his breath filter already on his face. What had Shida called it again? Lechegolves? He would have to remember that. The animal had not moved in the meantime, possibly figuring that his camouflage had been successful in warding off the predators so far. Now that James approached it again, it once again erupted in its sharp, paper-ripping hissing, and it almost seemed like it didn't even need to take a breath at any point. This time James wasn't so easily deterred, however, and after a moment of lining up his hands, he determinedly reached for the back of the creature's long neck with his organic hand, while holding onto its body, that was much closer to these seemingly sharp claws, with the mechanical one. With a single yank, he pulled it away from the wall, holding onto it firmly as it squirmed in his grasp with the ever-surprising strength even such slender reptiloids had. Yup, this was just like holding a monitor back on Earth. He wasn't happy. Definitely wasn't happy. Angry Pancake was no more, and it had instead become angry writhing mass of feathers, limbs and claws, scratching at his arm, which was the only part he could reach, wherever it could. It would take a bit before the animal would realize that, if he wanted to kill it, it would have likely done so at this point, and so he waited, holding on to the squirming lizard while it powered itself out. Slowly, his movements got slower and more sluggish, before it finally decided to at least momentarily surrender to whatever he was going to do with it, now that it became clear even to its primitive brain that he likely wasn't trying to eat it. With an exhausted sigh, James started to make his way out the door and into the corridor, where Shida was already waiting for him with two of their guards at her side. Based on their body types, James didn't immediately recognize either of them, so it wasn't someone he was particularly familiar with. However, the projected face shapes on their visors looked back at him with what he assumed to be amused smiles as they saw him carrying the lizard out of the room with widely outstretched arms, holding it like it could explode any second, which, honestly, wasn't too far from the truth. James was quite glad that, so far, musk didn't seem to be part of the lizard's natural defences, even though it wasn't quite outside of the realm of possibilities yet. The soldiers, as well as Shada, kept their distance, giving James more than enough room to wrangle the beast without its claws getting too close to anybody in the process, even if any damage it could do would only be superficial. It was an almost awkward elevator ride down, as everyone remained silent and stared at each other, or the lizard, although the mood was slightly held by the fact that their guards could barely repress their chuckles and sniggering whenever James had to adjust his grip because the reptile suddenly decided to move again. The looks of the Miat manning the front desk as soon as the elevator door opened to one of their patrons holding a wild animal in his hands and carrying it towards the front door was also quite amusing, as it was clearly something they hadn't experienced before in an establishment like this one. Of course, Shada had been absolutely right. This wasn't how things were done around here. That much was clear on the faces of the other patrons that populated the lobby's waiting area, which ranged from bemused glances to disapproving gazes at him. A cleaner that happened to be close by when James approached the door quickly opened the main entrance for him, so he could easily bring the beast outside without slowing down. Appreciatively, James nodded at them, before slightly picking up his pace and stepping out into the now significantly cooler outside air. Well, it was still pretty warm by his standards, but it was much cooler than earlier today. He waited a few steps away from the entrance until the rest of his group had caught up to him, and then looked back at Shada. "So, what do we do with him?" he asked, presenting the animal by slightly lifting it up a bit higher. Shada shrugged. "Just let it go somewhere," she instructed him nonchalantly, and put her hands inside her pockets as she distractedly looked around the street. Underneath his mask, James lifted an eyebrow at her, and looked around the concrete jungle himself. "Is this really the best place for that?" he asked, thinking that this didn't exactly look like the natural habitat of this species. But Shada yawned and waved him off. "Yeah, they're all around here, you can't get rid of them. As I said, that one probably just got lost in the vents or something. Just let him go and he'll find home on his own," she assured him, talking about it so extremely casually that he had little choice but to just believe her. Best we do it now that there's basically no traffic. Still not sure if this was the best course of action, but also really not feeling like contradicting both his girlfriend and his local guide yet again, James took a deep breath and complied, walking over to the next big alleyway that he could find, and slowly setting the lizard down. As soon as his claws made the slightest contact with the still warm floor, he began air paddling like a dog, making loud scraping sounds as he tried to somehow claw his way forwards. James released it from his grasp, and within a fraction of a second, it scampered off into the darkness, only leaving the sound of claws scraping on concrete behind. For a moment, James looked after it in the darkness. Then he clapped his gloved hands together after a job well done, hopefully also cleaning them from any lint or other leftovers the animal's feathers had left behind on them. "Well, that was something," he commented into the silence, before turning on his heels and moving to reconvene with the rest of his group. On his way, he glanced around the street again inquisitively. Shada was right. There was basically no traffic. Not only that, there was basically nothing. Apart from the still brightly shining lights of the hotel, most of the street was completely dark as far as he could see, with a few rare exceptions. No lights were on in most of the buildings. No headlights or vehicles driving around. Even streetlights seemed to be the exception rather than the norm, and at least for the moment, not a soul was in sight. Sure is quiet tonight. Their bodyguards made some acknowledging sounds and nodded their heads while also looking around in the dark, barren street. However, Shada seemed ever so slightly confused. "Well, what did you expect?" she asked with a raised eyebrow and a flickering ear. "Most people are already home at this time. Not like they're going to stick around if they don't have to." As if to demonstrate the emptiness further, she nonchalantly started to walk out onto the open street without so much as looking around for any possible vehicle possibly approaching them, much to the disapproval of their guards. She opened her arms widely and continued. "Only people you're going to find in the city at night are the poor schmucks that either have to live or work here for some reason." She said it with a sort of mixture of both a demeaning and a nostalgic tone that James really didn't know what to make of as he looked after her as she walked further down the middle of the street. After a few more steps, she stopped for a moment, turning towards him and their guards. "You wanted to look around, didn't you?" A few minutes later, he was casually walking alongside Shada, even though he wasn't exactly comfortable with walking in the danger zone as they did. Seeing the emptiness of everything, the guards held some respectful distance to allow the two of them to have a discreet conversation, even if James was sure that their voices carried far in the quiet night, even if they tried to keep them down. For anyone that could possibly come across them, it would have likely been quite the sight, seeing seemingly disembodied, slightly growing projections of faces float around in the darkness. An amusing thought, but still. "This is so fucking eerie," James quietly commented with a nervous chuckle, as the empty road just stretched on and on in front of them, showing off just how big the city actually was. And a city this big just wasn't supposed to be this quiet and empty, not even at night. "You think so?" she'd asked, her hands behind her head and her tail leisurely swinging around as she sauntered along beside him. "I mean, don't you think so?" James asked, with a glance over at her while the footsteps of his boots echoed from the walls of the buildings left and right. "It's just creepy when places are this empty." She'd pursed her lips and moved them from one side to the other as she thought about. "No, not really," she finally concluded after some consideration. "It's just an empty place. I mean, who should be around? The workers are at work, the brats are in their beds, and everyone else is at home and probably asleep or something. Maybe you'll find someone still up in the cramps, but not around here." As a mostly solitary species, Mia probably hadn't really developed the same senses of mild autophobia that plagued humans in liminal spaces like this one seemed to be, James figured. Still, he was feeling rather uncomfortable with this place that felt more and more alien by the moment, even if that was technically fitting. After a while of walking, they suddenly neared an intersection, and as James casually glanced down the crossing street, a lit-up building stood out like a sore thumb. The way it was completely alone in its busyness almost made the situation more instead of less weird. However, Shida had mentioned people still working, so James didn't take it as a bad sign, exactly. Noticing James staring at the strange establishment, she leaned in closer to him and discreetly whispered, "Gentlemen's Club. You can recognize them by the flags hung up all around. Those used to be closed back in the day, if you know what I mean. Before people knew what hygiene was. Also, they kept getting stolen." She made big air quotes around the name Gentlemen's Club, and indeed James could see colourful flags hung up all around the building, some even illuminated directly by lamps seemingly specifically installed for that purpose. Of course, all the things that could still be open in a place like this, it just had to be a brothel. And as much as that was fascinating in a way, he decided not to linger. "Poor guys," she had commented passingly, as James started to pick up his pace again to cross the intersection a bit quicker. "Bet whatever old hag runs that place is earning a fortune and a half on them." Based on his own experiences, James wasn't quite so sure if the guys were really the ones that deserved her pity here. However, he held back his judgment, figuring that maybe things just work differently around here. "Are you sure it's an old hag?" he asked instead, figuring he would keep the conversation a bit on the lighter side. Shida dismissively smacked her lips. "Usually is," she informed him casually, "but I guess it could be some upstart gal as well. Sometimes one of the workers takes over whenever the owner isn't fit for the job anymore." James tilted his head slightly. "And it couldn't be a guy?" he asked further, starting to get somewhat interested, even if the topic wasn't exactly his favourite. Shida shook her head, with her ears flapping around a bit as they were unusually relaxed and barely held any tension at all, which kind of confused James given the way she had talked about Dunama and its cities in the past. "Not impossible, but highly unlikely," she said confidently. "Men traditionally aren't exactly interested in that business. Well, except as customers, of course. Pretty hard to get the girls to do good work as a guy from what I've heard." "Huh," James mumbled, wondering why exactly that was, but too lost in thinking about it for himself to actually ask about it. Had men somehow less authority due to their libido? Was that possible? What other difference was there? And what if it was a club that didn't only employ girls? Were those around? Or was that a completely different story? Suddenly he felt Shida bump against him, and she put her head against his chest with one of her hands firmly placed on his sternum. "Just be glad you don't have to go to one of those places," she cooed, and tapped his chest with her fingers. "Not the greatest experience. The girls are professionals, but that's both good and bad." James paused for a second before he carefully replied, "You got experience?" He really hoped it didn't sound like an insult. Luckily, Shida just shook her head, making it rub against him even more. "Not me, but back in the brat house, some of the guys went to those places quite often," she informed him, making James stop for a second, as he stared down at her in slight shock. At first, Shida didn't seem to grasp why he was reacting that way, as she looked back at him, but then it clicked for her. "Oh, don't worry. They are old enough for it," she assured him quickly, with an amused wiggle of her ears. "No harm done there. just wasted a bunch of their money and energy on it, and had real trouble holding on to any girl afterwards, since they were so used to getting service whenever they wanted. Not too many girls putting up with that in the long run. James awkwardly cleared his throat, not quite sure if he really needed that information. Then again, this was Shada voluntarily opening up about her past on this planet, he now realized. And although the subject matter was questionable, he should probably encourage that. Is that a big problem around here? He asked, wondering if he could also steer the conversation in a direction that would give him something to work with when it came to connecting to the people of this world, if only tangentially. Shada shook her head again. Only for those who can afford it, or are very bad with both money and impulse control, she informed him passingly. Most people manage just fine and only substitute with the very occasional visit when things get too bad. I mean, guys on Earth manage too, no? She really seemed to know a lot about that. Was that just general knowledge, or was it connected to her upbringing with those fellas she mentioned? Both were equally likely in this case, and in the end, it didn't really matter all that much. Right now, he wondered a lot more what exactly had gotten her so cuddly all of a sudden, as he figured that it couldn't possibly be the subject matter. Could it? Okay, he replied, and lifted his hand to scratch the back of her head, that was still nestled against his chest even as they walked, and she almost immediately started to purr as soon as he made contact with her. And what's gone into you now? Romantic atmosphere of the night getting to you? She let out a breathless laugh, all the while her chest kept vibrating with the low, comforting sound. No, it's just nostalgia, she admitted, without even a moment of coyness. She even giggled briefly, needing to stop herself before she could continue with her reply. This was the thing for me back then, you know. Going out at night, through the empty streets, nobody there to bother you. I mean, living in the city, it sucks. I mean, living in a brat house isn't fun anywhere, but in the middle of the big city, you got the shittest deal in the shittest place, living in the cramps with everyone else who can't afford a better life. But at night the city was ours. Just know what places to stay away from and you can do anything, because who's going to stop you, you know? Been a while since then, of course, and I've mostly grown out of it. I mean, I didn't work my ass off back then just to go back to making trouble in empty streets at night to day. But, actually, maybe you're right. Maybe the romantic atmosphere did get to me. This was our best option for, you know, romantic stuff back in the day, after all. James felt like romantic was once again in big air quotes here, especially with the brief and contemplating look that Shada threw over to the floating faces of their bodyguards for a second there. James cleared his throat deliberately. We have a room for that now, he informed her semi-seriously with a soft chuckle. Yeah, I know, Shada murmured amusedly, and gave his sternum one last pat with her flat hand, before pushing away from him so they could walk separately again. Speaking of said room, it probably became time that they returned there. They did have quite the day ahead of them, after all, so they should get a proper rest before that. Then again, suggesting as much now could certainly be interpreted quite differently, even if that wasn't really what James had in mind at that moment. Before he could fully make up his mind, Shada was already prancing further ahead, still going down right in the middle of the road as if she owned the place. In fact, she picked up her pace quite a bit, leaving James to hurry after her so they wouldn't split up too much. Come on, I want to show you something, Shada playfully yelled over her shoulder, further adding to her odd behaviour. James tilted his head to the side as he followed her with quick steps. I thought you'd never been in here before, he commented, as the city they currently resided in may have been in the same general area as the one Shada grew up in, but it was still a good distance away from the Anteka. Some stuff's the same everywhere, Shada replied and hurried on, although she thankfully at least limited herself to a pace that humans could possibly keep up with. If she had wanted to, she could have left all the primates in the dust by a good margin. After some more minutes of confusedly following her through the dark, empty streets, surrounded by rounded buildings that flowed into each other like waves in the darkness, with only the occasional bit of light from the odd around-the-clock store or hotel breaking the monotony, something finally became visible in the distance. Lights. Hundreds of tiny speckled lights, like those of a hotel, but denser. More and more houses came into view. They reminded James of near-ancient Soviet-era buildings in their blockiness, although the edges were of course smoothed out. Still, they lacked the certain finesse in the way that they were built when compared to the rest of the surrounding architecture. Still a few streets away from the clearly most active part of the town, Shada came to a stop, allowing James and their guards to catch up to her at long last. James breathed a bit heavily underneath his mask, after having to power walk all this way in his very much non-sporty outfit, and with the air still being quite a bit warmer than he would have liked. Already he knew that another shower would be necessary before he could get into bed that night. Still, as Shida did nothing but expectantly look at him even now that he had reached her, he looked up at the illuminated buildings again. "I'm guessing those are," he mumbled between heavy breaths, and immediately Shida cut him off, completing the sentence for him. "The cramps," she said, matter-of-factly. "Generally it's translated as the slums, but the cramps is more like what we actually call them." "Since they're so cramped," James guessed, admittedly uncreatively. Then again, names like these rarely were exceedingly creative in the first place. And indeed, Shida nodded. "Yup, always at the southwestern side of each city, right where Stackax comes up in the morning," she explained further. And it took James a second before it clicked in his brain that Stackax was their name for their star. If there's one thing you can find in every city on Dunama, it's the cramps. James exhaled interestedly. "Every city?" he asked, just to reconfirm if she was using hyperbole. But Shida seemed quite confident when she replied, "Every city. Been like this for thousands of years." "Huh," was all James could reply, as he looked back up at the relatively tall, blocky buildings. This part certainly looked a lot more like the cities at night than he was used to, even if the streets themselves were still quite empty. At least there were rows and rows of illuminated windows shining a soft light down on them. "So, you want to go over there?" Shida had the audacity to scoff at him. "Oh, not at all," she said, with a lot of certainty in her voice. "I just really wanted to show you." James stared at her for a second. "Huh," was all he brought out once again, as he stared over to the buildings once more. Then, finally, he asked, "So, want to go back to the hotel?" Shida took a good, long look at the cramps, and deeply breathed in the night's air. "Yes," she finally said, with a sharp exhale and a determined nod, taking James by the arm as she turned back in the direction from whence they came. Then, she added cheekily, "Do you think the kitchen's still open?" James could only snort. "How would I know?"